won't be able to match that extremely interesting survey of European civilization that Jaime has just given us. I wanted to talk instead about freedom and the nation state, because this is an issue which I think now concerns us all. It's characteristic of our times to regard freedom as an attribute of individuals, to campaign for my freedom to choose my way of life, my rights to proceed in this or that way through life without interference, and to concede the social dimension of freedom only by default, by recognizing that whatever freedoms I claim, I must also grant. In other words, to admit that freedom can be limited only for the sake of freedom, and that all our claims to it are equal. Traditionally, it was not so. Freedom was regarded primarily as an attribute of the body politic as a whole. We Britons prided ourselves on living in a free country and regarded our freedom as primarily a quality of the institutions under which we lived and the space in which those institutions operated. Well, I remember returning aged 18 from a harrowing trip in the Middle East, having worked my passage back on a cargo ship, a Norwegian cargo ship, arriving in the dock of London, being pulled to the bank by a tug. The sudden change in air when I found myself again in the free country where I had been born. And that experience continues to come back to me. Freedom was seen as an inheritance, a feature of a way of life, not to be understood merely in terms of the multiplicity of options, still less in a list of civil rights. Free citizens were the product of free institutions. Their way of being was marked by a proud independence, a respect for others, and a sense of responsibility for their common way of life and the choices it protected. Fair-mindedness, generosity, a reluctance to take offence, combined with a determination to protect one's reputation against abuse and slander. All these attributes belonged to the free individual and belonged to him by virtue of public institutions in which he placed his trust and which he was tutored to defend both in thought and deed against those who would destroy them. Such an individual fought for the freedom of his country and for his own freedom only as part of that wider freedom. Now, I have no doubt that the free individual and the free country belong together and that the one will not survive without the other. However, the emphasis on individuals and their rights, the neglect of the duties that bind individuals to others and to the political order, and the growing grievance industry fostered by the welfare state are weakening our sense that our claims to individual freedom demand a kind of obedience in exchange. And it's about this obedience that I wish to speak. We have witnessed throughout the Western world, which used to be called, and rightly so, the free world, a turning away from any idea of inherited membership. The old ways of defining your social identity and the sphere of your obligations in terms of the religion, way of life, and national allegiance of your parents are typically repudiated. And indeed, as I have argued in many of my writings, a culture of repudiation has spread through our schools, universities, and the media to replace the frail and good-natured affirmations of our parents. This culture of repudiation does not satisfy its adherents, however. This is because the craving for membership, which is a deep adaptation of the species, will continue to exert the need for conformity and continue to search the world for a conformity of defiance, a belonging in rejection that will provide a new and bold identity in place of the old. This has given rise to a new kind of search for freedom. In claiming freedom, the new kind of liberal activist does not stop at affirming the right to choose a course of action. He or she builds around this right a rival identity, an identity in defiance, so to speak. And from this identity, there grows a kind of institutionalized rebuke, an attempt to claim space in the public world and to claim it from and against the existing public order and the unspoken conventions that have, over the years, made our free society possible. In this way, the pursuit of individual freedom, detached from the respect for duty and obedience, leads to a new denial of freedom. I think it is worth examining how this comes about. Every freedom creates a difference, the difference between those who exercise it and those who do not. And when you use this freedom to define your identity, you are in a certain measure identifying yourself as outside the community of those who retain the old forms of membership. And then it is a small move to the claim that the old forms of membership discriminate against you. There then arises an accusation of injustice. We have a right to non-discrimination, and the old forms of membership, since they shape the social world and its privileges according to a given idea of normality, are really forms of discrimination against the rivals and must be adjusted accordingly. More, the right to criticize the new forms of membership has to be curtailed, for criticism becomes reinterpreted as part of the pathology of the old way of life, the expression of phobias against the new forms that threaten its monopoly. This is all carried out in the name of freedom. Young people today often insist that the distinctions associated with their inherited culture between sexes, classes and races, between genders and orientations, between religions and lifestyles, should be rejected in the interests of an all-comprehending equality that leaves each person to be who she really is. A great negation sign has been placed in front of all the old distinctions, and an ethos of non-discrimination adopted in their stead. And yet this seeming open-mindedness inspires its proponents to silence those who offend against it. Certain opinions, namely those that make the forbidden distinctions, become heretical. By a move that Michael Polanyi described as moral inversion, an old form of moral censure is renewed by turning it against its erstwhile proponents. Thus, when a visiting speaker at a university is diagnosed as someone who makes invidious distinctions, he or she is very likely to be subjected to intimidation for being a supporter of old forms of intimidation. Or he or she might be disinvited. This happened to me last week. There may be no knowing in advance how the new heresies might be committed, or what exactly they are, since the ethic of non-discrimination is constantly evolving to undo distinctions that were only yesterday part of the fabric of reality. When Germaine Greer made the passing remark that in her opinion, women who regarded themselves as men were not, in the absence of a penis, actually members of the male sex, the remark was judged to be so offensive that a campaign was mounted to prevent her speaking at the University of Cardiff. The campaign was not successful, partly because Germaine Greer is the person she is, but the fact that she had committed a heresy was unknown to her at the time, and probably only dawned on her accusers in the course of practicing that morning's 2-minute hate. The reasons for the ethic of non-discrimination and for the moral inversion that has made it into a fierce form of discrimination directed against whoever transgresses its fluid and unpredictable boundaries lie deep. The Enlightenment, which sought for a world in which reason has a head start over prejudice in all public debate, also sowed the seeds of its own destruction in exalting individual autonomy above every form of obedience. "I am my own author," was the Enlightenment slogan. "I can be what I choose to be, provided I do no harm to others." Social conventions, traditional forms of life, divisions of roles and communal identities, even the differences in social status associated with the biological division of labor between the sexes, all such things are of no significance compared with my free choice whether or not to give credence to them. Little by little, as the old authorities slipped away or lost their aura, more and more of human life was stripped of the rules, customs, and distinctions that make sense of it, and more did everything in life, everything that might matter to me and constitute my personal happiness, become an object of choice in which only I have the right of action and nobody else has the right to interfere. Hence, nobody now may impose upon me an identity that I myself have not chosen. My nature as a self-created being is inviolable. Your disapproval of my lifestyle is your problem, not mine. Should you object to my homosexuality, that proves only that you suffer from homophobia, a disorder of the soul that is also a hangover from an outmoded form of life. There is therefore no room now for argument about homosexuality, still less for criticism. Just to question the advisability of gay marriage, for example, is to be branded as a homophobe, which has radical career consequences in our universities. Your objection to Islam and the presence in our midst of its adherents is your problem, a sign of Islamophobia, a mental disease that unaccountably swept across the Western world on the 11th of September 2001. Racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, all the isms and phobias that call down the damning tirades of the orthodox are the residue of old and vanquished forms of life, last gasps of Western civilization in its vain attempt to cling to its empire among the living. That is what Germaine Greer came up against, a new and unexpected extension of the morality of self-choice, which tells us that we are guilty of transphobia if we deny of a person that it can decide for herself what gender he is. This is all very well, you might say, but it does not yet constitute an assault on individual freedom, and that is true. It is perfectly possible to accept the latest adventure in non-discrimination while allowing others to speak out against it. However, it doesn't work that way. The furore over the transgender issue comes into the general category of identity politics. It is about who you are, not what you think. So thinking the wrong thing, still more saying the wrong thing, is an act of aggression, the equivalent of racist abuse or sexual harassment in the workplace. The non-discrimination movement is about extending to others the freedom to choose their own identity. To criticize this is to constrain other people in their deepest being, in those existential choices that determine who they are. It is an act of aggression and not just a comment, hence it must be punished. We see here the equivalent of the censorship of heresy in religious communities. The heretic threatens the community by undermining an assumption on which membership depends. He or she has to be silenced for the community's sake. In the community of non-membership, in which every identity is freely chosen, the heretic who believes in objective distinctions is just as much a threat as the Shiite in a Sunni shrine. He must be exposed, punished, and if possible, silenced. If you wish to understand why our freedoms today are under assault, therefore, then you must first see that they are under assault from within and from the very concept of freedom, used in that way to affirm an identity politics whose effect is social fragmentation. The effect of this is not felt merely in intellectual circles, in universities and their courses in gender studies and the like. It spreads through the whole of society by virtue of political correctness, by which I mean a kind of superstitious fear of betraying some traditional attachment in the face of any attack on it from the champion of this or that alternative. I will give a recent and important case of this, which most of you will know about. In the town of Rotherham in Yorkshire, as in so many of our towns today, the children of drug-addicted, criminal or incompetent and neglectful parents are sometimes taken into care by the local council as the result of a court order. These vulnerable children are in need of help and protection and also often targeted by sexual predators. Girls in the care of Rotherham Council were regularly targeted in that way by gangs of men from the local Muslim immigrant community and essentially treated as sex slaves, even sold into prostitution abroad or in other parts of the kingdom. The police refused to investigate complaints made by the parents for fear of being judged to be racist, and the local council likewise decided that it would be politically incorrect to do anything save turn a blind eye. Any other course of action would raise the feared question of identity, namely the question whether we as British citizens must accept a way of treating young girls which certain immigrant communities regard as normal or even deserved. We must give way to the rival identity rather than affirm our own. And with that decision, of course, comes the death of the idea of the free country. Now, the case is important for two reasons. First, it illustrates the way the new identity politics erodes individual freedom by attacking the attributes of a free society. When my parents told me that I live in a free country, one whose freedom they had defended in the war against Hitler, I knew that they were referring to a tangible feature of public life. They had in mind an openness, an ease, a civic responsibility that were everywhere apparent, even if never mentioned. In trouble, they told me, I could turn to the forces of law and order to protect me. I should never fear to tell the truth, since the truth would prevail in any case, and all around me were people accustomed to coming to the aid of those in distress, who trusted the law and acknowledged that truth is protected. The girls in Rotherham did not belong to such a country. It so happened that two of them were courageous enough to stand up to their mistreatment in such a way as to force the authorities to take note of it, but though not before their lives had been irreparably damaged. In this case, we see the way in which political correctness can be an assault on freedom, since by taking away the shared identity that makes a shared obedience and a shared responsibility to the rule of law not just possible, but the norm of public behaviour. The council officers and the police force in Rotherham had been emasculated, to use a politically incorrect word, by political correctness. They feared to follow their duties as protectors of our freedoms. They feared to act according to the only identity that bound them and which underpinned their real duties. Instead, they gave way to criminal organizations who could beleaguer them with a rival identity that no one dared to criticize. There is another reason for the importance of the case, however, which is that the two identities that came to the fore in this case correspond to a growing conflict in the wider world. On the one hand, there is the old British, and let's be frank, English sense of belonging to a place governed by law, in which people live side by side as strangers and trust to the rules that protect them, and a certain kind of Muslim immigrant identity of belonging to a family in which women are either pure and hidden or impure and exploitable. Radical Islam is not merely threatening world order, it is inviting us to a belated but necessary consciousness of our identity and of the role of our national identity in protecting freedom in both the senses I have been discussing, the freedom of the individual and the free society that stands vigil over him, bringing others to his aid, as they were not brought to the aid of those girls in Rotherham. It is to this task that our energies ought now to be directed, in my view, to the task of defining and defending the national identity that is ours. And the demand that we do this underlay the surprising results both of the United Kingdom referendum and the United States presidential election. Results surprising because they express the feelings of people who have been most affected, and in a negative way, by the culture of repudiation. So here, in summary, is what I believe we should be affirming as teachers, as public intellectuals, and as politicians. We should recognize that freedom is nothing if we cannot protect it against the predators. Protection can be offered only by institutions to which we owe obedience, and which can call on that obedience in times of threat. We are heirs to a society which is governed by law, and in which the people themselves make the law through their representatives, and can change the law when circumstances change. Our law is secular, not laid down for all time by God, but adjusted and amended in the interests of reconciliation and peace. This is made possible because we, the people, know who we are and define our identity not by our religion, our tribe, or our race, but by our country, the place where our man-made law prevails, the sovereign territory that is ours. This sovereign territory is our home, and it is in terms of it that our public duties are defined. We may have religious and family duties too, but they are private affairs which distinguish one group of citizens from another. Our public duties are defined by the secular law laid down by institutions that embody the spirit of a country and the customs that prevail within its borders. We could put the point in another way. Our freedom as individuals is predicated on our membership of a political society. This society consists of people assembled according to the sovereign territory that they occupy, under an inherited system of government which they, the people, play a part in appointing, and through which their competing interests are consulted and reconciled. That defines the first person plural, the we of the nation state, and in my view, it is infinitely to be preferred to the rivals, to the we of the tribe, or the we of the ruling oligarchy, as in Russia, or the we of religion. Yet rival we's are at this very moment eyeing our assets with a view to imposing themselves. And it is time for us to wake up to what we have, to the great blessing of a national identity and a shared home within whose borders we are, or at least should be, freely governed. It has become politically incorrect to affirm such things and to affirm one's loyalty to the nation state. The European Union insists that those who do so commit the heinous crimes of racism and xenophobia, and similar things were said during the American presidential election, condemning those voters who took against illegal immigration or what they took to be unfair trade agreements that damaged their way of life. The issues here are complex, and of course for another occasion, but let it be said that so powerful is the regime of censorship and intimidation under which we now live in the Western democracies, that no voters will confess to their primary loyalty, be it to England, France, or the United States, when they have been told that to do so will open them to the charge of racism, xenophobia, or, as Hillary Clinton put the point, you name it. And that is why the opinion polls were so wrong, both in the matter of Brexit and that of the American election. National loyalty has been branded a sin by the governing elite, even though there is no other loyalty that can be called upon in the great emergencies that we might at any moment confront, by which I mean Russian expansion into the territories formerly controlled by the Soviet Union and mass immigration following an Islamist coup in Algeria. These are grim possibilities, and I don't want to end on a note of warning, for it seems to me that the national identity that I, as an Englishman, have inherited, the identity of a nation joined in a union of like-minded nations in a single sovereign territory, is far more robust than its detractors assume, and it has, like the American identity, a remarkable capacity to absorb incomers and to integrate them by a process of mutual adaptation, as we can see from the Mayor of London. My only caveat is that we can adapt to the effects of inward migration only if we affirm our identity, believe in what we are, and renew our obedience to the institutions and customs that define us. In other words, the global processes that challenge us now are reasons to affirm national sovereignty and not to repudiate it, for national sovereignty is all that we have.